I walked into Andrew's sister's house thinking it would be just another noisy family dinner. You know the kind. People talking over each other, kids running around, that comforting mix of laughter and clinking glasses. For a moment, I actually felt my shoulders drop, letting the warmth of it all settle over me. The smell of roasted chicken filled the air, and I remember thinking how nice it felt to be somewhere familiar. Nothing strange, nothing heavy. Just a normal night that was supposed to stay normal. I watched Andrew laughing with his brother-in-law, that relaxed laugh I knew so well. It made me believe everything between us was steady, even if routine had softened some edges. I'd learned to read him over the years, the little shifts in his tone, the tension in his neck, the way his eyes moved when he hid something. But tonight? Nothing. Not a single sign that something was brewing under that casual smile. And that's exactly why what happened next hit me so hard, like a glass dropping in slow motion. Then, little Leo climbed onto his chair and looked at me with those innocent big eyes, ready to share something he clearly thought was delightful. His timing, his tone, his absolute lack of awareness, everything about that moment felt disarmingly pure. I had no clue he was about to drop a sentence that would freeze the entire table. But when he opened his mouth and spoke, it was like the room shifted under my feet, as if everyone but me knew a truth I hadn't even begun to imagine. And that's exactly where everything started to unravel. The moment Leo asked, "Auntie Melissa, did you see the pretty lady Uncle Andrew picks up from school every day?" It felt like the whole house inhaled at once. Every fork froze mid-air, and every conversation died instantly, like someone had flipped a switch. I felt a strange numbness crawl up my spine, the kind that makes your heartbeat echo a little too loudly in your ears. I looked at Leo, hoping I had misheard him, praying my brain had filled in words that weren't actually there. But his smile stayed wide, innocent, proud even, like he'd just shared the most harmless secret. And I knew deep down that kids don't invent details that specific. Trying to keep my voice steady, I asked him gently what he meant, and he just kept talking. So cheerful, so certain. "The one with long hair?" he said, as if he were describing a cartoon character he loved. Andrew went pale so fast I swear I saw the color drain from his neck all the way up to his forehead. He leaned in, trying to hush Leo with a forced laugh. But there was panic behind his eyes. Real panic. The kind you can't hide even when you're pretending everything is fine. And it was in that moment that the first crack formed in the version of Andrew I thought I knew. Around the table, everyone avoided looking directly at me, as if eye contact might shatter whatever fragile calm still existed. Andrew's sister looked confused. His mother clutched her napkin, and I sat there holding a smile that felt glued onto my face. 1,000 thoughts started racing. Was he cheating? Was Leo mistaken? Was I imagining the tension? But one thing was undeniable. Andrew wasn't breathing normally. And when a man's guilt walks into the room before his excuses do, the truth is never far behind. I just didn't know yet how deep it ran or how far I'd have to go to uncover it. I tried to swallow the knot forming in my throat, but it felt like my body had turned to stone. Andrew kept insisting Leo was making up stories, but his voice cracked in a way that made the entire table feel even colder. Kids lie to avoid trouble, sure, but they don't lie when they're excited to impress you. And Leo was glowing, swinging his legs under the chair, repeating how super pretty the woman was. I felt my chest tighten, not from jealousy, but from the undeniable certainty that something was deeply wrong. Every instinct inside me whispered the same thing. This wasn't a misunderstanding. I forced myself to smile, to breathe, to act as if none of this was crashing into me like a tidal wave. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, waiting for my reaction, waiting to see if I would crumble, explode, or pretend everything was fine. I chose the last one, mostly because I didn't trust my voice not to shake. Andrew avoided looking at me entirely, staring down at his plate like it might save him from drowning. And in that silence, I realized how much you can learn from what someone refuses to do. He wasn't defending himself. He was hiding. As dinner awkwardly resumed around us, the noise felt different. Hollow, strained, almost distant. I kept replaying Leo's words in my head, each repetition sharpening the dread in my stomach. I didn't ask Andrew anything else. Not there, not in front of his family. I simply sat back and watched him unravel quietly beside me, like a man waiting for a verdict he already knew was coming. And while everyone else tried to pretend the moment had passed, I knew better. Something had cracked open, and once it did, there was no closing it again. I just had no idea how explosive the truth would become once we stepped outside that door. The second we stepped outside, the cold air felt like a slap that finally jolted me out of my polite silence. I didn't even wait for Andrew to close the car door. The words came out sharp, steady, colder than I'd expected from myself. "Who is she, Andrew?" I watched his shoulders tense instantly, like he'd been bracing for this moment ever since Leo opened his mouth. It's strange how quickly a person's face can shift, from familiar to foreign, in a matter of seconds. And that's exactly what happened as he turned toward me, already scrambling for excuses. He didn't give me answers. He gave me deflections. You know that tone someone uses when they hope you'll drop the subject if they repeat something enough times? That was him. "Kids imagine things," he said, waving his hand like Leo's words were some silly fantasy. But Andrew was terrible at lying when cornered, and tonight his voice shook just enough to betray him. I'd spent years knowing his patterns, and this wasn't confusion. This was fear. His. And the more he talked, the quieter I felt myself become, like anger was settling deeper instead of bursting out. When he finally claimed he was picking up a coworker's daughter, something inside me froze. Not because the excuse was absurd, but because he said it like he expected me to believe it without question. As if my trust were something he could cash in whenever he needed cover. I stared at him, trying to recognize the man I had married, but all I saw was someone hiding behind half-truths. And the silence that followed wasn't surrender. It was strategy. I knew that pressing him now would lead nowhere. If I wanted the truth, I would have to get it myself. I could feel the anger tightening in my chest, but there was something colder beneath it, a clarity I hadn't expected. While Andrew kept insisting I was overreacting, I watched the way his jaw clicked, the way he couldn't keep eye contact for more than a second. People tell the truth with their bodies long before they tell it with their words. And every inch of him was screaming guilt. The parking lot around us was quiet, just the faint hum of traffic in the distance. But between us, it felt like a storm was gathering, a storm he knew he couldn't outrun. When I asked why he had never mentioned this supposed favor to a coworker, he snapped so fast it startled even him. "Because you always turn things into a big deal," he said, like the real problem wasn't the mysterious woman, but my reaction to it. That's what cheaters do. They flip the script, rewrite the narrative, hope you question your sanity before you question them. And hearing that tone, that sharpness, something inside me clicked into place. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't Leo confusing someone at school. This was a man terrified of his own truth leaking out. I stood there, staring at him, letting the silence become its own accusation. He kept talking, piling on flimsy explanations, but none of them stuck. They fell apart the moment they left his mouth. And while he kept trying to steer the conversation, something unexpected happened inside me. I felt my anger shift into determination. Not the kind you yell with, but the kind that sits in your bones and sharpens your instincts. I realized I didn't need him to confess. I didn't need another argument or another excuse. What I needed was evidence, and I already knew exactly where to find it. I didn't say another word after that. Not one. And the silence between us became heavier than anything either of us could have yelled. Andrew kept glancing at me like he was waiting for me to scream or break down, but I refused to give him anything he could use against me later. Sometimes silence is the loudest thing in a marriage, and that night, mine said everything he didn't want to hear. He shifted uncomfortably, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel, the same nervous habit he had when he knew he'd crossed a line. As we drove home, he kept trying to fill the space with half apologies and half lies, but I wasn't listening anymore. I was thinking about Leo's innocent face, about how children don't filter, don't embellish, don't understand consequences. They just say what they see. And Leo had seen something that wasn't meant to reach me. That truth alone told me more than Andrew ever would. And with every mile we drove, my heart hardened. Not out of hatred, but out of necessity. I knew now that whatever he was hiding, he wasn't going to admit it willingly. By the time we reached the driveway, I had already made up my mind. I wasn't going to ask him for the truth again. I wasn't going to argue or defend myself or play the part of the emotional wife he expected me to be. No one should have to beg for honesty. So I walked inside, hung up my purse, and decided that if Andrew wanted to keep burying the truth, I would dig it up myself. And the very next day, I would go exactly where Leo unknowingly pointed me, the school. The next afternoon, I parked my car across from Leo's school, with my heart pounding harder than I expected. I told myself I was just here to clear things up, but deep down, I already knew the truth I was chasing. The schoolyard buzzed with parents waiting, kids laughing, teachers waving goodbye. Ordinary scenes that suddenly felt painfully sharp. I watched each detail like my life depended on it. Every sound, every movement felt amplified. And under all of it, there was this heavy, quiet ache sitting right in the center of my chest. I kept checking the clock on the dashboard, each passing minute pulling me tighter into my own nerves. At 2:59, I spotted Andrew's car turning into the parking lot. My breath caught. I'd seen that car hundreds of times, but in that moment, it felt like the vehicle transporting the final piece of my sanity. He parked casually, like a man with nothing to hide, leaning back as he waited. That calmness, so smooth, so routine, stung worse than anger. It made me realize he'd been living a double life so effortlessly I hadn't even felt the cracks forming beneath my feet. Then I saw her. A young woman walking toward him with this bright, carefree smile. The kind you give someone you're excited to see. Long hair, soft features, and a confidence that said she knew exactly where she belonged. In his arms. And when she reached his car, she didn't hesitate. She touched his arm, laughed, leaned in close. Watching it from a distance felt like watching a version of my life shatter into pieces too small to gather. I wasn't imagining anything. This was real, painfully, humiliatingly real. I felt my stomach twist when she leaned into his car window, her fingers brushing his cheek like it was the most natural thing in the world. And then, as if the universe wanted to make sure I understood exactly what I was seeing, he kissed her. Not a hesitant kiss. Not a mistake. A familiar, practiced one, the kind you give someone you've kissed 100 times before. My hand covered my mouth on instinct, not to hide tears, but to muffle the sound of my own disbelief. I wasn't prepared for that kind of pain, the kind that burns silent and deep. It felt like something inside me cracked open. I didn't cry. It was strange, but I didn't. Instead, everything inside me went cold, like a switch had flipped. My sadness drained out, replaced by this sharp, focused stillness. I watched them in total silence, their smiles, their touches, the ease between them. He had brought her here, to a school, to a place connected to his family, to me. That realization shook me. He wasn't hiding an affair. He was living it out loud, trusting that I would never look close enough to see it. And something about that arrogance ignited a fire I didn't know I had. My hands were steady when I grabbed my phone, steadier than they should have been. I took photos from every angle, zooming in, zooming out, capturing every careless moment they shared. Then I hit record. The sound of their laughter leaked through my speakers, soft but undeniable. I wanted proof. Solid, indisputable proof. Not for him. For me. For every moment I had doubted my instincts, defended him, excused him. And as I recorded them, something fierce settled inside me. If he wanted to play in daylight, then daylight was exactly where I would expose him. As I kept filming, a strange calm settled over me, almost like my body had separated from my emotions just to survive the moment. I watched Andrew open the passenger door for her, watched the way she slipped inside with a smile that belonged to someone who thought she was the only woman in his world. And standing there, hidden behind my windshield, I realized I wasn't witnessing a mistake. I was witnessing a routine, a pattern, a secret carved so deeply into his daily life that he didn't even bother to hide it. And that hurt more than the kiss itself. When they drove off together, I didn't follow. There was no point. I already had everything I needed. Instead, I sat in my parked car, letting the weight of the truth settle in. I thought about our marriage, about the years I had devoted to him, about the woman I had allowed myself to be beside him. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something unfamiliar. Power. Not the loud, explosive kind. The quiet kind. The kind that rises slowly from broken pieces and sharpens into resolve. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't trapped. I was wide awake. Before leaving, I took one last look at the school, the place where my life had split into before and after. The playground noise, the parents rushing home, the ordinary world moving on without knowing what had just happened inside me. I turned the key in the ignition, feeling a steadiness growing in my chest. If Andrew wanted to lie, if he wanted to build a life behind my back, then I would show him what truth looked like in the light. And I already knew exactly where I would reveal it. I didn't wait long to put my plan in motion. The very next morning, with my hands still shaking from everything I'd seen at the school, I called Andrew's sister. My voice sounded calm, too calm, but I knew she wouldn't question it. She'd always trusted me, always welcomed me into her home without hesitation. When I asked if she could host another family dinner the following week, she agreed instantly, cheerful and unsuspecting. She had no idea she'd just agreed to set the stage for the truth. And honestly, that was the exact kind of innocence I needed. As the days passed, I felt a strange mixture of dread and anticipation building inside me. Not because I doubted my decision, but because I finally understood the weight of what I was about to reveal. I kept replaying that moment in the school parking lot, the laughter, the kiss, the ease between them. Every time it flashed in my mind, my resolve hardened. This wasn't about revenge out of spite. It was about truth, accountability, and finally stepping out of the fog he'd kept me in. I wasn't breaking our marriage. He had already done that. When the day of the dinner finally arrived, I dressed slowly, deliberately. I wanted to look composed, steady, untouchable. As I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back. Stronger, sharper, no longer begging for honesty. Andrew seemed nervous, pacing around the living room, but he didn't dare ask why. He must have sensed something shifting, something he couldn't control. And deep down, I think he already knew the truth. This time, I wasn't arriving at dinner as his wife. I was arriving as the woman who would expose him. When we arrived at his sister's house, I could feel Andrew stiffen beside me as if the air itself had warned him something was off. He kept glancing at me, waiting for some clue, some sign of what mood I was in. But I gave him nothing. Just a polite smile, calm and steady, the kind that makes a guilty man sweat. Inside, everyone was chatting, setting the table, pouring drinks, completely unaware of the storm I had slipped into the room with. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the upper hand shift. I wasn't the one walking on eggshells anymore. Dinner started normally, at least for them. For me, every detail felt heightened. The clink of glasses, the hum of conversation, Leo running around showing off a new toy. I watched Andrew out of the corner of my eye. He laughed too loudly, talked too quickly, jumped at every sudden noise. His guilt didn't sit quietly. It sat right there at the table, thick enough for me to taste. And knowing what I was about to do, a calm washed over me. Not cruel, not vindictive, just the certainty that the truth deserved a witness. When the moment felt right, I stood up. Not dramatically, not angrily, just with a quiet confidence that made the room still. Every head turned toward me, even Leo with his wide, curious eyes. Andrew froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. I could sense his panic before he even opened his mouth to stop me. "Melissa, sit down," he whispered, his voice cracking. But I didn't. I looked at Leo instead, offering him a soft smile that held gratitude he didn't yet understand. This was the moment everything would shift, and I wasn't holding back anymore. I took a slow breath, steadying myself before speaking. "I want to thank Leo," I said, letting my voice carry just enough weight to make everyone listen. The room fell silent instantly. Andrew shot up in his chair, his panic almost palpable. "Melissa, don't," he hissed, but there was no stopping what had already begun. Leo looked proud, sweet, absolutely oblivious to the chaos he had unknowingly unraveled. "You helped me see something very important last week," I continued, keeping my eyes on him, giving him the gentleness he deserved. Before anyone could ask what I meant, I pulled my phone from my purse and walked to the TV. My fingers didn't shake. Not at all. Andrew lunged toward me, whispering desperate pleas, but I stepped out of his reach. And then, with one tap, the screen lit up. The footage began playing, filling the room with the soft laughter of the woman from the school. Her face appeared clearly, then Andrew's, then the kiss. Gasps burst around the table. His mother clutched her chest. His sister covered her mouth. Leo buried his face in his hands, startled by the sudden shift from innocence to truth. Andrew sank back into his chair, his face drained of every ounce of color. "Melissa, please, turn it off," he whispered. Broken, small. Nothing like the man who'd lied so confidently days before. But I didn't. I stood tall, letting every frame of betrayal speak for itself. When the video ended, I walked back to the table with my head held high, pulled a stack of papers from my bag, and dropped them in front of him. Divorce papers. Not a threat. A decision. And as the room filled with stunned silence, I knew this was only the beginning of the final chapter of my freedom. Andrew came home hours later, and the first thing I noticed was the sound of his footsteps. Heavy, uneven, almost dragging. He didn't slam the door like I expected. He closed it softly, like he was afraid the house itself might shatter under the weight of what happened. When he walked into the living room, his face was red, his eyes wild with humiliation and anger. "You embarrassed me in front of my family," he spat, as if that was the crime. Not the affair, not the deceit, but the exposure. I stared at him, and for the first time, I saw a stranger. His voice got louder, harsher, desperate in a way that made it clear he wasn't sorry. He was cornered. "We can fix this," he insisted, pacing, running his hands through his hair like he was trying to pull a solution out of thin air. It was almost unbelievable. After everything I'd seen, everything I'd shown, he still thought there was a version of our marriage left to salvage. I listened, but only because I wanted to remember this moment. The moment he realized the consequences he'd never imagined would touch him. The moment I held all the power. When he finally stopped talking, I let the silence settle between us before I spoke. "I didn't cheat in front of my family," I said, my voice calm, steady, and colder than anything I'd ever said to him before. That single sentence shut him down. His mouth opened, closed, opened again, but nothing came out. I could see the realization hitting him. The truth wasn't going to be negotiated away this time. He wasn't facing the forgiving version of me he'd relied on for years. He was facing the version he created with every lie he thought he'd gotten away with. I walked past him calmly, opened the hallway closet, and pulled out the suitcase I'd packed earlier that day. I didn't rush. I didn't tremble. Every zipper, every movement felt like reclaiming a piece of myself he'd chipped away over the years. When I handed it to him, he stared at it in disbelief, like he couldn't understand a world where I wasn't begging him to stay. "Leave," I said quietly. "Go stay with your pretty school pickup." My voice didn't crack. My hands didn't shake. It felt like truth finally speaking through me. He blinked at me as if I'd slapped him. "Melissa, please," he whispered, suddenly small, suddenly vulnerable, suddenly afraid. Funny how quickly guilt turns into desperation once the consequences arrive. But I didn't soften. Not this time. I remembered every lie he'd told, every shift in his tone, every night he'd walked past me carrying secrets he thought I was too blind to see. His pleas weren't about love. They were about losing the comfort of a life he never appreciated. And I refused to be anyone's safety net ever again. When he realized I wasn't changing my mind, his shoulders dropped, and he nodded, barely. A weak, defeated gesture that told me everything. He picked up the suitcase, avoiding my eyes, and walked to the door with the slow, heavy steps of a man who'd finally run out of excuses. I watched him leave without a word, without a tear, without the ache I once feared I'd feel. There was no grief, no mourning, just a stillness settling inside me that felt liberating. The kind of stillness that comes only when the truth has finally cleared the air. When the door finally clicked shut behind him, I stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle over the house like a blanket I hadn't realized I needed. No shouting, no excuses, no weight pressing against my chest. I took a slow breath and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Space. Space to think. Space to feel. Space to exist without tiptoeing around someone else's lies. It was strange how peace could feel both foreign and familiar at the same time, like coming home to myself after being gone too long. I walked through the living room, picking up a few things absent-mindedly, not because they needed organizing, but because my hands needed a moment to catch up with my heart. I expected sadness to hit me eventually, like a delayed wave, but it never came. Instead, I felt steady, clear. I thought of Leo, innocent little Leo, completely unaware of the storm he had revealed with a single question. Children don't mean to save you. They just tell the truth they see. And sometimes, that truth is the light you didn't know you needed. Later that night, I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the quiet street outside. No tears, no doubts. Just a gentle recognition that I had stepped into a new chapter, one I didn't need to fear. I didn't dwell on Andrew or the woman or the lies. I thought about myself, my freedom, my future. And as I sipped the warm tea, I realized something simple but powerful. The life I was stepping into wasn't built on revenge. It was built on truth. And now that I finally had it, I wasn't letting it go.